If your last name is O'Neill, Gallagher, Boyle, Doherty, Donnelly, O'Reilly, Flynn, Campbell, Quinn, or O'Rourke, geneticists believe you may be carrying a piece of DNA that traces back to one single man. A warlord, a king, someone who may have lived over 1,600 years ago in a corner of northwest Ireland most people have never heard of. This isn't folklore. It's the conclusion of an actual genetic study, and it may connect you to a documented, traceable clan far more directly than most family trees ever could. This is the real science behind Irish surnames, ancient Gaelic clans, and one of the most remarkable Y-chromosome discoveries ever made in European genetics. For most people with Irish ancestry, a surname is just a name, something inherited, something on a passport, maybe a source of pride at a parade once a year. Names like O'Neill or O'Doherty get treated the same as any other family name, a label passed down with no deeper meaning attached beyond whatever county your ancestors happen to leave. That assumption misses something genuinely unusual about how Irish surnames work and how old the tradition actually is. Ireland has one of the oldest surname systems in the world, older than most of Western Europe. And unlike many countries, where surnames often describe a profession or a hometown, Irish surnames were built specifically to describe ancestry. The prefix O' means grandson or descendant of. The prefix Mac means son of. When medieval Irish families adopted hereditary surnames around 1,000 years ago, they weren't just choosing a label. They were making a genealogical claim, stating outright in the name itself exactly which ancestor they believed they descended from. Most of Ireland's Y-chromosome DNA belongs to a single broad lineage, haplogroup R1b, which shows up in well over 80% of Irish men, one of the highest concentrations of that lineage found anywhere in the world. That single fact already tells you something about Irish population history, generations of relatively contained ancestry on an island at the edge of Europe. But within that broad 80%, geneticists have found much finer detail, specific branches, specific subsignatures, that map onto Ireland's history far more precisely than anyone expected. For centuries, that claim was treated as tradition and nothing more. Then, in February of 2006, a team of geneticists at Trinity College Dublin, led by population geneticist Dan Bradley, put that 1,000-year-old claim to an actual genetic test. Here is the first real crack in the assumption that these are just names. The research team, publishing in the American Journal of Human Genetics, analyzed Y-chromosome data, the genetic marker passed almost unchanged from father to son across generations, from men across Ireland. They found a specific distinctive genetic signature, now classified as haplogroup RMO222, appearing far more often than random chance could explain. Across Ireland as a whole, roughly 1 in 12 men carried it. In the northwest of the country, in County Donegal specifically, that number jumped to nearly 1 in 5. That kind of concentration doesn't happen by accident. It happens when one lineage, one family expands explosively for generation after generation, at the expense of almost everyone around it. The researchers connected this genetic signature to a specific historical dynasty, the Uí Néill, whose name literally translates to descendants of Niall. And Niall, according to Irish legend, was Niall of the Nine Hostages, a high king who ruled from Tara in the late 4th or early 5th century, famous in old texts for taking hostages from the regions he conquered as a strategy of political control, and for leading raids as far as the British and French coastlines. Some accounts even connect him to the capture of a young Roman-British boy who would later escape and return to Ireland as a missionary, a man history remembers as St. Patrick. For over 1,000 years, the Uí Néill dynasty descended from Niall, ruled significant portions of Ireland, splitting over time into northern and southern branches, each controlling its own territory, each producing its own line of kings, right up until the 11th century when the wider political landscape of Gaelic Ireland finally began to shift. The genetic data lines up almost perfectly with where their power was strongest. When the researchers cross-referenced the RM222 signature against known Irish surname records, the pattern held. Surnames long associated with Uí Néill septs: O'Neill, O'Doherty, O'Donnell and Donnelly, O'Gallagher and Gallagher, O'Boyle and Boyle, O'Reilly, Flynn, Campbell, Quinn, O'Rourke, and several others, carried the signature at rates far higher than the Irish population average. 1,000 years of oral genealogy, once dismissed by outsiders as unreliable folklore, turned out to be tracking something genuinely encoded in the Y-chromosome the whole time. It's worth being precise about what that actually means for any one individual, since not everyone who shares one of these surnames will necessarily carry the marker. Surnames spread through more than just direct biological descent, through fostering, adoption into a sept, name changes at Ellis Island, and the ordinary genealogical noise of over 1,000 years of history. What the study shows isn't that every O'Neill or every Doherty descends from Niall. It shows that these particular surnames carry the signature at a rate dramatically higher than random chance would predict, evidence strong enough to convince population geneticists, even while individual family lines can and do vary. Picture Ireland in the year 400, before any of these surnames existed. Small, fortified settlements scattered across a landscape of forest and bog. Kingship was not inherited the way a modern crown passes down. It was fought for, negotiated through alliance and hostage-taking, and constantly contested between rival dynasties spread across the island. A warlord at Tara consolidating power through marriage alliances, hostage-taking and military expansion, fathering children across multiple unions the way successful medieval rulers often did, each son eventually founding his own branch of an expanding dynasty, each branch pushing into new territory, absorbing or displacing smaller rival families as it went. None of them had any concept of DNA. They only knew lineage, loyalty, and land. 600 years later, when Irish families finally began adopting permanent surnames, entire branches of this dynasty chose names that pointed directly back to him, without any way of knowing that geneticists 16 centuries later would be able to check their math. Here's the twist that makes this story more careful and more interesting than a simple one-king origin story. When geneticists studied the genetic diversity within the RM222 signature itself, measuring how many small mutations had accumulated across different branches of it, a technique that works something like a molecular clock, they calculated that the founding mutation actually appears to be roughly 3,400 years old, nearly twice as old as Niall of the 9 hostages himself. That means the genetic marker didn't originate with Niall personally. It almost certainly existed in his ancestral line for centuries, quietly passed down through generation after generation of ordinary, undocumented Bronze Age and Iron Age families long before he was ever born. What Niall's dynasty appears to have done isn't create this signature. It amplified it, spreading it explosively through political dominance, marriage alliances, and sheer reproductive success, turning an already existing, unremarkable lineage into the genetic fingerprint of an entire ruling class within just a handful of centuries. This is exactly the kind of nuance that separates careful science from the version of this story that spreads casually online. Niall of the 9 hostages likely wasn't the origin point of this DNA. He was the reason it stopped being rare. The reach of that expansion goes further than most people expect. And this is where the story becomes personal for Irish America specifically. The same research found the RM222 signature in roughly 1 in 10 men across western and central Scotland, tracing the medieval expansion of Gaelic populations across the Irish Sea, likely connected to Ulster settlers and the Scots-Irish migrations that later fed directly into colonial America. And in a sample of men in New York City carrying Irish surnames, researchers found the signature in about 1 in 50 individuals, a small but measurable echo of a Donegal dynasty, still traceable in the DNA of Irish American men living in Ocean and 16 centuries away from where the story began. For anyone curious enough to check this in their own family, the marker itself is straightforward to test for. A Y-chromosome DNA test, taken specifically by men since the Y-chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son, can identify whether someone carries the RM222 signature or one of its many downstream branches that have since been mapped by genetic genealogists. It won't prove a direct link to Niall of the 9 hostages personally, given how old the underlying mutation actually is, but paired with one of these 10 surnames, and a family tree that traces back to Ireland's northwest, it's about as close as modern science can get to testing a 1,000-year-old genealogical claim. If your surname is on this list, this is what your DNA may actually be carrying. Not just a family name passed down out of habit, but a specific, testable genetic thread connecting you to one of early medieval Ireland's most powerful dynasties, a lineage old enough to predate the king it's named after, successful enough to dominate the genetic record of an entire region, and durable enough to still be measurable in Irish American communities today. Names like O'Neill and Gallagher and Doherty were never just labels. In Ireland, they were always meant as a claim about where you came from. It took over 1,000 years and a modern genetics lab to finally prove that, in at least one remarkable case, the claim was exactly right. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. Long before genetics existed as a science, before anyone understood chromosomes or mutations or molecular clocks, Irish families were already keeping a kind of genealogical record, encoded not in a lab report, but in the very sound of their own name, repeated at baptisms and funerals and townland boundaries for 40 generations. The DNA didn't create the clan. The clan was always there, carried forward in memory and language, waiting for the science to finally catch up and confirm what an entire people had been saying about themselves the whole time.